for now.
Thank you. Okay, we have a welcome from Dr. Zhao.
Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Victor Zhao, the President of the National Academy of Medicine. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the 51st National Academy of Medicine annual meeting. Thank you for spending your Sunday afternoon or morning in the West Coast with us. For members of the public who are joining us for the first time and may not be familiar with the National Academies, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. We were chartered by Congress and President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 as an independent advisor to the nation on matters of science, technology, and health. Over the years, we've gained a reputation of providing independent, science-based and trusted advice impacting the nation and the world. The National Academy of Medicine have distinguished members who are at the forefront of discovery and progress in health medicine and the biomedical sciences. Held every October, the NAM annual meeting is the gathering of our distinguished members and the most important meeting of the year for the organization. Now, COVID has created immense challenges for all of us over the past 20 months, but it's also offered opportunities to innovate and adapt. So last year, for the first time, we decided to conduct the meeting entirely virtually and open our interest group meetings to the public. This approach was really quite successful. We decided to continue it this year. Now, the interest groups bring together NAM members from a variety of disciplines and sections to enrich the understanding and to engage in dynamic conversation on pertinent scientific and policy topics. You know, the program is driven totally by the NAM members. All interest groups meet during the annual meeting. They may develop new ideas for program activities or other initiatives by the NAM and assist membership sections in the discovery of outstanding candidates for membership, especially younger individuals working in interdisciplinary or emerging fields. In fact, I've been so impressed with the enthusiasm and engagement of members in the interest groups and the quality of interest group programs that I'm thinking of making the interest group program as part of the official scientific program every year in the future. So please stay tuned. So I hope you join the scientific program tomorrow. We have an outstanding program in store for all of you. The theme of this year's program is Crossing the Policy and Equity Chasms, Lessons Learned from Compounding Health Crisis. And it will focus on the importance of science-informed policy to address the existential, persistent health threats and inequities of COVID-19 and climate change. It's going to be a great event with the keynote opening from Dr. Eric Lander, President Biden's science advisor, Director of the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, and a member of the President's Cabinet. In addition, there will be a number of distinguished speakers and leaders. Towards the end of the scientific meeting, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra, will deliver a closing keynote. After the scientific meeting, I'll chair the President's Forum, which will formally discuss the NAM's Grand Challenge on health, human health, and climate change. The forum will kick off with an opening keynote address from Gina McCarthy, the White House National Climate Advisor. The scientific meeting will begin promptly at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time, and I hope I'll see you all there. And now over to the interest group session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and some new ones as well. This is interest group number 16. Our topic is rehabilitation and human function. And this year, our subsection, that's 8C of the National Academy, decided we wanted to explore healthy longevity. For those of you who are members of the Academy, you know well that this has been an initiative and a significant financial commitment on the part of industry and the National Academy. And so we selected this topic, healthy longevity, for our IG presentation today. And we have two world-class, outstanding speakers, which you will hear about and from in just a short while. I would like to give you just a little overview of the Healthy Longevity Initiative that was started really almost 2 full years ago by Dr. Zhao when he presented the direction that the National Academy was going to take with respect to healthy longevity. It integrated global priorities and actions that needed to be addressed from a report that the Academy put out, hoping to reach these goals by 2030. Optimize for all health, function, and well-being. We don't have a corner on function and well-being, but we certainly identify with it, and it has been one of our goals as an interest group and as a subsection to spread the word about function and rehabilitation. So we're taking that opportunity today. Because of dramatic breakthroughs in medicine, public health, social, and economic development, there have been unprecedented extensions of the human lifespan. Globally, it's a real challenge. Today, 8.5% of people are over 65, and by 2050, that is thought to reach 1.6 billion people, and the population of oldest old, that is 80 and older, is expected to more than triple between 2015 and 2050. So at the current pace, the population aging is poised to impose a substantial strain on our economies, our health systems, and social structures worldwide. But it doesn't have to. And so this committee was formed under the chairpersonships of Dr. Linda Fried and Dr. John Yuli Wang to mount a grand challenge fundamentally to stimulate research through a process of jump-starting young, curious investigators. And once that got started, and there would be a pyramidal effect, to develop accelerator grants, which were substantially more than the catalyst, and then champion among those that were selected as the most outstanding. And so this is a major commitment on the part of the National Academy. And basically, one of the goals highlighted and supported is function, which is the focus of this interest group. And I would just define the word function, taken from our ICF classification, and many on this call have been leaders in helping to define, refine, and proselytize the utilization of this concept. Functioning is defined as a dynamic interaction between her or his health conditions, environmental factors, and personal factors. And that is essentially what we have been working from as a professional society and as individuals. So 2 contributors to functioning will be discussed today. One, appropriate evaluations and measurement of function, and the other, physical activity, nutrition, and dietary behaviors. The title of one is Function, Frailty, and the Implications of Screening for Risk, and the other, The Relevance of Nutrition for Functionally Successful Aging. Start your questions now in your own mind and pepper our speakers as we go forward. And thank you once again for participating. Let's hear it for senior women's tennis.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our speakers today. So our first speaker, Dr. Jonathan Bean, will be speaking on function, frailty, and screening for at-risk in older adults. Dr. Bean is a professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School and is a staff member at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital. He is the director of the New England Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Center at the VA Boston Healthcare System. And he is the very first ever physiatrist to be appointed to this role. Dr. Bean also serves on the editorial board for the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. He served on the governance committee for the Association of Academic Physiatrists and has served as the liaison between the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and the American Geriatric Society. Dr. Bean is internationally recognized for his expertise in geriatric rehabilitative care, having extensive experience in the conduct of clinical trials and the measurement of disablement outcomes. He has been repeatedly recognized for this expertise with awards from the Association of Academic Physiatrists, the Gerontological Society of America, and the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine. We are delighted to have him with us today to share his wisdom and expertise. If you have questions for him, I encourage you to raise your hand once he's finished and engage in dialogue, or during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat so that we can address them at the end of the presentation. And thank you, Dr. Bean, for your presence here and sharing with us your wisdom. The Zoom room is.
Thank you. I just want to confirm that everyone can see my slides. I'm sharing the screen successfully. All right.
Yes.
So I'll be talking about function, frailty, and the implications of screening risk in older adults, which really is walking down the path of treatment. And I'll be talking about a lot of the work that's been done in the field. And I'll also highlight some of the work we've been doing ourselves to address treatment paradigms in geriatric rehabilitative care that are focused on prevention. Let me see here, advancing slide. All right, so we're going to cover the first part, just screening risk for older adults, then conceptualizing function as a guide for treatment. How do we deliver high quality care? And then rehabilitation as prevention. I want to acknowledge the support that I've had for some of the work that I'll be presenting here. And we'll get started. So I want you all to imagine that you are a primary care physician and you have a busy practice and you have a large percentage of older adults in your waiting area. And in fact, the next patient is actually one that's going to undergo the Medicare mandated annual wellness visit, a visit that's been designed to identify older adults that are at risk for adverse health outcomes and an opportunity to employ some sort of preventative care measures. And this is particularly important because, as you know, the oldest adults are the fastest growing segment of our population. And when you consider older adults, they have very high levels of comorbidity. And you also know that using a specific care paradigm for a disease, single disease, does not really fit well for patients that have multiple comorbidities. So the challenge is, what is the risk? What is the screening tool that best identifies people at risk? And as you're walking into the room, it really begs the question, which vital sign is most helpful to you for identifying if this patient should or shouldn't be treated with preventative care? Well, actually, the vital sign that is best predictive of this is the one that wasn't measured. And it was the speed with which they walked into the room. And so this is an article from JAMA in 2014. And along the x-axis, as you go from the right side to the left side, gait speed gets progressively slower. And on the y-axis, what you're actually seeing there is actually predicting disability as the outcome, be it ADL-related disability or mobility-related disability. But as it turns out, it doesn't really matter what outcome you put in there. You could put in hospitalization, you could put in falls, you could put in mortality, and you'd still see this strong relationship between gait speed and its association with adverse health outcomes. And it's so powerful that it's been advocated as a vital sign to be utilized in primary care for the exact purpose that I mentioned. Now, the real question is sort of, why is that? Why would a measure like gait speed be predictive? And I think the best way to think about it is to actually think about an orchestra. If you think of each of the sections of the orchestra working together to produce a beautiful piece of music, you could also think in contrast, where if there were certain sections of the orchestra that weren't working as well, that were maybe deficient in some way, that the resulting music would really not be very pleasant at all. And it's sort of, it holds as well as you think about that with regard to our body systems. So if you think of our different organ systems working together to be able to enable us to walk normally or to walk optimally with the best possible walking speed, when we start to see that slow, it's reflective of deficiencies in the underlying body systems that are controlling that, that are contributing to that activity. So that really brings up the issue about frailty. When we think about frailty and how it's defined, is that it's in the aging literature and geriatric literature, it's a state of increased vulnerability due to stressors that are caused by decreased physiologic reserves. And it's really recognized as a way of identifying who is able to undergo a stress. And so therefore, models of frailty have been developed to actually develop empiric measures for identifying who's at risk for various procedures, be they surgical procedures or be they other sorts of medical events, and sort of characterizing their risk. And so this really has tremendous relevance for all types of care. And as well as you think about it from a standpoint of rehabilitation, it's also is reflective of the opposite of resilience, the ability to withstand distress. And so the empiric models that have been developed are generally based on the comprehensive geriatric assessment. And it really looks at patients and their corresponding deficits in their different organ systems going from head to toe, with also a regard for sort of social setting and as well as functioning. And both major paradigms that exist out there include counting deficits. And I know Linda Fried was mentioned, and she really was a seminal figure in the development of frailty measures with the frailty phenotype. And also in Canada, there's Ken Rockwood, who's developed the frailty index and the clinical frailty scale, which I'll show you in a little bit. So when you think about operationally defining frailty, the frailty phenotype really describes 5 characteristics: weakness, slowness in the form of gait speed, reduced physical activity, fatigue or reduced energy, and weight loss. And this was really based on the clinical experience and consensus among geriatric care providers, and then was proven empirically through work within the cardiovascular health study and many subsequent studies. Now, the frailty index takes a little different look at it. And what it does is it looks at a whole list of deficits that a geriatrician might evaluate in the context of their comprehensive geriatric assessment. And what they've shown is that you could look at anywhere from 30 to 50 potential deficits in an individual. And what you may do is then check off the ones that are actually deficient, and from the number, the denominator of the possible deficits to what's actually observed is actually an index that's calculated. And what's been demonstrated through multiple studies and multiple data sets internationally is that even if there's some variability in the number and the denominator of characteristics, that that index generally holds true at being predictive. And the interesting thing about both of these measures is that both have been adapted for use with EMR data and have been used on large scale to identify risk among larger populations. And here's an example of this, and this is specifically looking at the impact of COVID and survival with COVID. And this is based on Rockwood's work, and it was the clinical frailty scale. And what was shown is that people with more severe frailty had a worse survival time after a hospitalization for COVID. And this is a large-scale, multi-center observational cohort study done in Europe. Now, also, prior to that, there were other studies that looked at the Rockwood measures of frailty and really showing that it predict institutionalization and also mortality as well. And these figures are actually showing the clinical frailty scale, but there's other reports where they have the index and you see just about the same phenomenon. But I highlight the clinical frailty scale because this was actually developed because Dr. Rockwood's brother is an orthopedist. And as we know, orthopods are generally not going to do the same sort of comprehensive assessment that a geriatrician would. And so they needed to have a very simple scale that would allow an orthopedist to be able to determine a patient's frailty. And so what they ended up looking at was really a scale of their physical functioning. So at the top of the scale, you have someone who's very fit, who's very robust, active, and energetic. And at the lower end, you have people that are very severely frail or even terminally ill. And it does also account for the manifestation of cognitive impairment in the scoring, but essentially it is predictive of these adverse health outcomes. But it also highlights an important issue that's been recognized with the large variety of frailty measures out there, which is that it's very difficult to differentiate frailty measures from disability measures. And so this was a comprehensive review that was done and recently published, where they looked at over 200 measures of frailty in the literature, and they found that over 50% had frailty relying on ADL items. Now, when you speak to people that are really focused and interested in frailty predominantly, they have no problem with this because they feel like evaluating functioning is a really critical piece of identifying someone who's vulnerable to adverse health outcomes. But it does pose challenges from the standpoint of defining disability from frailty, or when you're thinking about using it in different contexts. And this was really highlighted in this article as well. And I'll give you an example of this. So here's another paper that looked specifically at the frailty index, and it used a functional performance measure called the short physical performance battery. Now, the short physical performance battery is the measure from which gait speed, all the information about gait speed was originally derived because it's a composite measure of 3 tasks. 1 is gait speed, 2 is standing balance, and 3 is chair stand time. And each one scored between 0 to 4 with a maximal score of 12. And so what you see is that as you go from 12 to 0 in scores of SPPB, you see a strong correlation between the index on the frailty index and the corresponding SPPB scores. And so what this article actually showed was very similar data with the frailty phenotype as well. And the argument was made that the SPPB could be a sort of crosswalk between those measures, and really serves as a measure of frailty in and of itself. So in a way, really, frailty measures are functional measures and are largely based on functional measures. Though I will add that with the frailty index, when they've looked at and they've removed the actual functional parameters and looked at the more physiologic parameters, they still see that it has a predictive value as well. So just to kind of summarize the frailty measures, they're particularly good because they can be used in EMR data, that you can identify people that are vulnerable to stressors. You can look at it on an individual basis and also on a population basis. There are the 2 measures that I described that are sort of the predominant measures in the field, and both can utilize EMR data to predict risk across populations. On the more challenging side, frailty is commonly conflated with function. And so that's very critical if, for example, you're going to use frailty as an outcome measure, or you're going to target function in your treatment in that context, because you end up finding that function predicts function potentially. And so that's an important issue to consider. Another is that it lacks some dimensionality, is that it's a focus on the patient and the corresponding deficits, and it doesn't really consider the interrelationships between disablement outcomes that we'll talk about in just a little bit and that are highlighted in the ICF model. So next, I want to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize function as a guide for treatment. And in order to do so, I want to sort of just highlight this image that I'm showing here. So this is a woman crossing the street, and you can't really visualize it very well, but it took her about 6 seconds to realize the light had changed. And on the left panel, it says 54 seconds. And you can perhaps see on the right panel that it says then 15 seconds. So it took her 45 seconds to cross the street, or 46. Now, a year after I took this photograph, they reduced the time to cross the street to 35 seconds. So essentially, she's no longer able to participate in her life role and living in her community, when this is in Brookline, Massachusetts. And so this is someone for whom treatment would be indicated. And we'd want to think about, well, what would the ingredients of treatment be that would optimize her ability to walk as quickly as possible across the street? And so this really was something that guided a lot of our work and really guides the conceptual model of the ICF model. And the notion is that you have deficits at the level of body functions and structures here on the left that are characterized as impairments. And activities such as walking speed, when deficient, are defined as limitations. And those are then related to participation in a life role, which when deficient is restricted. And all of this is influenced by comorbidity or health conditions, environmental factors, and personal factors. And as many of you know, this has been the conceptual model that's guided a lot of the World Health Organization and rehabilitative care. Now, an important point that I want to emphasize is that when you start to look at these outcomes empirically, when you're based on the left side, those are largely determined by biologic factors. So when we look at what are predictors of impairments in body functions and structures, it can be based on cellular mechanism, physiologic mechanisms, largely more biologic factors. But as you start to look at predictors of more distal outcomes, like activities, you end up finding that at the best, with biologic predictors, you can describe about 50% of the variance in gait speed or in mobility tasks with that. And that there's a lot of social and behavioral factors that contribute to the variance in the performance of activities. And when you get to participation, it's more even stronger based on social and behavioral factors. And so we might need to think about that as we design our treatment, which I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation. The other important part is that this will be part of ICD-11, or at least that's the plan in the future. And so more than just rehab providers are going to need to be facile in understanding this conceptual model and being able to characterize their patients and their corresponding treatment accordingly. So I want to highlight some of the empiric evidence that we've developed over time to sort of show these interrelationships and to potentially guide treatment. And to do that, we conducted, I should say, a longitudinal cohort study among 13 primary care practices from Mass General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, the greater Boston area. And we looked at primary care patients that were older and at risk for functional decline, and we evaluated them on an annual basis over 2 years. And what we were looking at, what we were primarily focused on, is from the literature, we could identify about a dozen different impairments that were identified as being relevant to mobility skills. And we wanted to identify the subset that were most predictive of mobility decline over 2 years of follow-up. And what we ended up finding was that there were really 4 attributes: limb strength, limb speed of movement, limb range of motion, and also trunk muscle endurance, which really gets at the endurance of our core and trunk muscles. And in parallel research, I want to highlight work done by Jeff Hausdorff and separately by Jennifer Brock that have also identified timing and coordination of gait as also important attributes that are predictive of this as well. And so what this really identified for us, well, here's a subset of attributes that we could target in our care and potentially could drive improvements in mobility skills. But we were also interested in understanding whether it really held that there were these interrelationships between body systems, activities, and participation. And what we were able to do is look at what predictors of participation in life roles 2 years later, after 2 years of follow-up in our Boston Rise cohort, and look at these same attributes at baseline. And what we found was that the majority of those actually acted through, in this study, mobility activities in their influence on participation. Now, leg speed had a direct effect, but also there may have been other mobility skills that were more basic that may actually have been mediated that association. But it really, the take home was that there was indeed this sort of interrelationship between body system impairments, activity limitations, and participation in a life role. Now, the other thing that's particularly important in geriatric research was the notion of comorbidity. And I talked about the high rates of comorbidity, where typically a primary care patient might manifest 5 or 6 chronic diseases at one time that are being managed by the primary care. And so there's a lot of debate in the geriatric literature about whether there were actually patterns of comorbidity or whether we should just consider counts of comorbidity. And so we looked again at the Boston Rise cohort, and we evaluated individuals based on their patterns of comorbidity. And indeed, we were able to identify 3 different latent classes that we defined as a low burden of comorbidity, a high burden of comorbidity, and a predominantly musculoskeletal comorbidity. But when we looked at those classes versus actual counts and looked at them in their ability, in their association with the ICF disablement outcomes, what we found was that the latent classes were not significantly associated. But when we looked at comorbidity in terms of counts, it was strongly associated with impairments, limitation, and participation restrictions. And so what it really highlighted for us, in a way, it makes it simpler for us when we're considering comorbidity and how we might account for it, that we may just look at the overall burden in terms of counts than worrying about the actual classes. And that was what was highlighted in this work. Now, we've also looked at personal factors as well. And so this was a separate clinical trial that was done, was published in JAMA in 2014. And it was a focus on patients that had completed care after undergoing a hip fracture and having had a surgical repair for that. And so many of these people underwent subacute rehabilitative care, which we'll touch upon a little bit later as well. And so once they had finished all their rehab, as many of you know, the outcomes are still quite poor for these individuals that survive, both in terms of survival as well as return to appropriate or prior levels of physical functioning. And so the purpose of this study was to have a treatment that was targeted to people once they finished all their rehab, and the control was an education program. Now, the treatment was an exercise-based program that was delivered with 2 physical therapy visits and provision of a DVD, which had an exercise program on it. And the exercise program focused on important impairments, as well as the optimization of functional activities. And also embedded in it was a focus on behavior change, with a notion that that was critical for long-term benefits. And what we saw and what's shown in the figure on the right, in this case, looking at outcomes of short physical performance battery, but also this was shown with patient-reported measures of functioning, was that there were robust differences at 6 months among those that were in the treatment versus the control. What we also observed was that those improvements were maintained 3 months after treatment ended at 6 months. So treatment ended at 6 months, the DVD and the video player was taken away, but they still maintained their functioning 3 months later. And within a separate analysis, when that was looked at, it was shown that changes in self-efficacy were what were really driving, were a major component of what was driving those long-term outcomes. So there was indeed an impact on behavior change, on those sort of personal motivational factors that made a difference in their long-term physical functioning. Now, next, I want to sort of highlight some empiric evidence related to the influence of environmental factors on these outcomes. And I think that if we all pause for a minute and think about what we're experiencing with this pandemic, I think many of us have anecdotal experience of older individuals who, when they were under conditions of lockdown, we were able to observe that their physical functioning and maybe cognitive functioning as well declined because of the lack of social engagement that occurred. Now, prior to the pandemic, we conducted a study in Boston Rise. We were looking at an established relationship between cognitive impairment, in this case, mild cognitive impairment, and falls. And it was pretty well established that that was a predictor of falls, that mild cognitive impairment was associated with a higher rate of falls than people that didn't have mild cognitive impairment. And we began to look, we looked at this in terms of the level of social engagement. And when we looked at people with low social engagement, we saw that this relationship held. But when we looked at people with high social engagement, we saw that it was actually protective. Now, this was a cross-sectional study amongst a relatively small sample. And so it's hard to really generalize this more broadly, but it really begins to highlight the power of social engagement in predicting adverse health outcomes, such as falls. And in separate analyses, we also saw this as well with regard to mobility overall. Now, I also want to highlight other work that's done by a colleague at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Amar Dand, who's a neurologist. And he's particularly interested in social networks and the structure of social networks and the impact on outcomes. In this case, he's specifically looking at stroke outcomes. And what he was able to show in this paper in Frontiers in Neurology, which was published relatively recently, was that aspects or important characteristics of the social network of the participants was actually predictive of patient-reported function after completion of stroke rehab. This is the Fugl-Meyer. Walk time, again, walking speed, and even scores of depression. So again, showing this relationship between the impact of social engagement and social networks and functional outcomes. So I hope with this sort of walk through some of the empiric evidence, it shows that the ICF model is not just conceptually based, but actually empirically based as well. So I told you the scenario of this woman crossing the street. And so the next issue is, how should we think about care for an older individual such as this? And when we think about care in general, about value in care, there's a big focus on what matters most to patients. And it's been actually defined that value in healthcare, in this article by Porter and Lee, is based on that health outcomes achieved that matter most to patients relative to the cost of achieving those outcomes. That represents value. But when we look at older adults and we ask them, what matters most to you? Now, there's many different things, but predominantly one of the most biggest priorities for older adults seeking care with their primary care physician is actually maintaining functional independence. So function is actually a major goal of older adults, and maintaining independence. So one of the other challenges that faces the world of geriatric care and this growing segment of older adults is, how do we position healthcare systems to best serve older adults? Now, one thing that the geriatric field has reflected on and recognized is that there'll never be enough geriatricians to care for all of these older adults. And so they've been very active, and this is a photo of Mary Tinetti, who's really a leader with this initiative, where they've said, how can we train healthcare systems and healthcare providers to think like geriatricians when they're caring for their older patients? How can we get them to think of them in the same way? What's the lens that they can look through? And they talk about the 4 M's. They talk about mentation, focus on cognition and mood. They talk about mobility, physical functioning, which we've talked a lot about. They talk about medications, be it too many medications or choosing the wrong medications for a given condition that put older adults at risk. And they also talk about what matters most as being really critical factors. And this is being implemented nationally, and a focus on each one of these M's has been shown to improve the quality of care for older adults. And so they're really advocating a focus on all 4 M's. So that's the age-friendly healthcare systems approach, and that's geriatric care. But if we're going to think about geriatric rehabilitative care, we do focus on a lot on these 4 attributes to varying degrees. For sure, we do. But we also focus on motivation. And so we think about motivation and behavior change, which I alluded to. But one of the first things that I was taught as a young physiatrist was first evaluating a patient's capacity to learn, because so much of rehab relies on that capacity to learn. And be it practicing good nutrition or practicing any sort of preventative care paradigm, it's critical that the person is motivated to carry out those new behaviors. And so you could think of it as 1 M for every finger of the hand. So now I'm going to touch a little bit on how we've been focusing on designing rehabilitative care in order to position it as a model of preventative care for older adults in VA. And so one thing that we did was we said, well, gait speed needs to be a vital sign. And these are data from an early stage clinical demonstration project that we did within a couple primary care practices, where we looked at older veterans that were 65 years and older. And we measured their gait speed on their way to walking to the scale to get their height and weight checked. And what we found was that 25% of them had a gait speed that was 0.8 meters per second or slower, which is considered a threshold of high risk and one that's worthy of treatment in the literature. And in fact, the literature has even described 1 meter per second, and that's probably 50% of the older veterans that we screened. And so this is one way that you can actually use gait speed to help sort of pick how big a net do you want to cast with your various preventative care paradigm. But clearly it was a prevalent problem and a concern for a large number of aging veterans in our healthcare system. And so we've developed the Live Long, Walk Strong program. It was first developed before I moved back to the VA in 2016. It was started when I was primarily working at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital. And there's really, what it's designed about is to sort of reposition physical therapists to more optimally serve an individual that would be referred because they had a gait speed that was 0.8 meters per second or lower. And the 3 components are to focus on those core physiologic impairments that I highlighted, that we identified as putting people at risk for decline. A focus on coaching and behavior change in order to optimize long-term improvements, in order to engage people in the functional activities and be able to enable them to better participate in their life role. And then also case management, not only working with the primary care providers, but also working with community-based programs to further reinforce engagement and participation in activities. And so this is data from the initial clinical demonstration project that we did at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital. In total, we actually did over 400 individuals, but this is the data that we actually published. We had 363 referrals. Now, these were people that had mobility problems, and this was referral for an outpatient physical therapy program of about 10 to 12 visits. And so it's understandable that 40% could not enroll because they had mobility problems themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we address their concerns. But what we found is that of those, the majority actually enrolled in the program, and over 3/4 completed the full program of care, and about 25% partially completed the program of care, with the program being interrupted due to health issues or other issues that it would occur. And so this is really the outcomes. And if you look at this figure on the right, the gray area is representative of scores on the short physical performance battery. If you go from left to right in that little plot there, you see that a 1 unit change is considered a very large clinically meaningful difference in the short physical performance battery. And at the very bottom on the list, the bottom row shows the adjusted change that we observed in among people undergoing Live Long Walk Strong was about 1.7 units. So this exceeded a large clinically meaningful difference. But then we also analyzed to look at what are factors that could potentially mitigate improvement or engagement with rehabilitation to see how they influence the outcomes. Because we designed the program to sort of navigate and overcome those barriers. And that could be advanced age, it could be a history of falls, could be the manifestation of dementia, it could be significant pain, or it could just be their stage of exercise change, their readiness to engage in exercise. And what we found was that regardless of any of those factors, we still exceeded clinically meaningful differences when we looked at these factors individually. And so that we still were addressing the goals of our program overall, that even accounting for these potentially mitigating factors, that we were creating improvements in physical functioning at the end of 3 months of care. Now, I mentioned the 40% that never engaged. And so that creates a challenge that we've been forced to address in COVID, but before COVID, we were very interested in looking at models or potential hybrid models of telehealth. And so what we did was we were interested in an approach to care where we would take those physical therapy visits and make them more user-friendly by reducing them down to 6 visits and giving the participant a choice to either have that at home or have that in an outpatient setting. And we also gave them an iPad tablet where on the tablet was a video of the person doing their exercises, and they had prompts reminding them of their corresponding exercises. There was also a chat feature that allowed them to interact with their physical therapist. And treatment went on for 6 months that way. And then there were 3 more months where they could use the chat feature to further communicate with their therapist. And at the end of 1 year, we evaluated outcomes. And the comparison group was actually the Boston RISE study, those patients that were in that longitudinal cohort study. And the 75 people in the treatment groups were recruited in the exact same way as the cohort study, but they were actually treated. Whoops. And what we found was that we actually had quite good adherence among participants really over the whole year. But in particular, there was a drop off after the 10 to 12 month period. When the chat feature was removed, there was adherence certainly dropped. But we saw good adherence where they were participating in their exercise program twice a week with over 60% over the course of the full year. When we looked at our outcomes and mobility performance, at the end of 1 year, we saw significant and clinically meaningful improvements in both gait speed and the short physical performance battery. But what was also very exciting was that we actually saw, we weren't planning to power our study to address these outcomes, but we saw a 73% reduction in the rate of emergency room visits among people that were treated compared to those that were in controls. Now, hospitalizations, we were clearly not powered we were not powered to evaluate that as an outcome. But what we did see was that the effect size was in the hypothesized direction. And so it really highlights that there's an opportunity to do more work in this area, but the potential of this approach to care. Now, what we've done since then, and have been influenced a bit by COVID as well, is that we've now adapted our Live Long Walk Strong program to subacute care in VA, which is a major focus of care in VA and outside of VA, as I mentioned before. And we've adapted the program to include to treat patients during the inpatient stay, and then to also have a series of follow-up visits over 4 weeks once they're transitioned to home care. And if we look at the components of our treatment, the coaching and behavior change occurs in all of those visits across the board. The focus on physiologic impairments is more heavily weighted during their inpatient stay. And the focus on case management is more focused in the latter stages. And there were delays in implementation of this clinical demonstration project because of COVID. But some of the early findings that we found is that at the end of the stay within the CLC is really the SNF, the subacute nursing setting, we saw that the level of improvement in physical functioning, which is measured by the AMPAC in this case, exceeds clinically meaningful differences. And that also those differences are still observed 3 months after they're discharged from the subacute care setting. However, if we look at the magnitude of improvement that occurs once they're discharged from the subacute setting, it's really negligent. There's really minimal. And so there's really an opportunity for us to address this in a better way in the future. And so what I really would like to really conclude with is that hopefully I've highlighted for you how we could think about older individuals, how we can recognize how measures of function and frailty are highly related and are able to identify individuals at risk, and how we might use the ICF model as a way of conceptualizing treatment, and how, if we think about geriatric rehabilitative care and geriatric preventative care, we want to think about the 5 M's as well. Thank you very much.
Well, that was just remarkable. Thank you so much, Dr. Bean. I would like to ask a couple of questions, and I think there may be some in the audience as well. Let's take Gerald. Dr. Stuckey, do you want to start us out?
Yeah, if you allow me, so I'm really excited about this presentation. Congratulations. And you really have demonstrated that using the ICF conceptual framework may help us to structure research, both not only conceptually, but also empirically. So it goes both ways, and also to structure it treatment-wise. And I think this was a model presentation that should be given to many other communities that are caring for other populations, maybe not aging, but you could take any other population. And you could basically use your approach as a model. So I'm really congratulating you and thanking you for showing this. I had one comment and one question, if you allow. My comment was, you, in my view, very clearly pointed out the problem of distinguishing what is body functions, and if you go for the capacity, and we should not conflate it necessarily with measures then that go into people's performance in their real life, because one is the outcome, one is a predictor in, for example, in outcomes research. And one way to overcome that would be to basically consider capacity versus performance. And in activity, we can really distinguish measures of a person's capacity for a daily activity versus what they actually do. And then my question then is, frailty versus functioning. Isn't frailty another animal, in the sense that frailty is more close to a syndrome? So, I mean, you put together a range of things. It's not a health condition, it's not a disease, but it's something like close to what a health condition may entail. And how you capture it is actually through your approach of assessing person's function, capacity, interaction with the environment. So frailty and functioning, more health condition versus how you assess it.
Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate your comments, and obviously your seminal leadership with the ICF model in general. We do use measures that I believe you would call capacity measures in terms of patient-reported measures of functioning, and we use those a lot. I just was limited in my ability with a presentation to show all the different types of work that we're doing. So we do rely on that a lot. The AMPAC is a measure that we use quite frequently in that regard. We've used the late life function disability instrument. there's a lot of debate. I work with a lot of geriatricians, and some of whom are very active in frailty. And there is a sort of tension that we have in our conversations, a friendly tension. Some of us would like to distinguish frailty from disability, or frailty from measures of physical functioning. But I'm starting to sort of move in their direction in a sense of saying that, look, frailty for older individuals represents a state of vulnerability to stressors. And that's a really critical thing that we need to evaluate and consider as we're planning out our treatment paradigm. And so, you know, if you have someone who's a 20-year-old who maybe grew up with CP and is, you know, they may not hold that their gait speed is going to be predictive of how well they're going to do if they undergo surgery or whatever. Amy can speak to that much better than I can. But I think that for older adults, those relationships hold pretty true. And so there is a significant amount of overlap, but I think that what I try to work with my geriatric and gerontology colleagues is to understand the nuanced differences between impairment, limitation, and restrictions, because you can't call them equivocal. And the other thing that I will say that we really focus on is that, you know, this is very much based on, I know John White's on the call, and notions of enablement theory in terms of treatment. We also have done specific work looking at targeting those specific impairments and showing that we have a treatment that can address those impairments, and that also that can then directly impact functioning as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
I would like to ask Lynn to the mic so that she can ask her question.
Thank you. So Jonathan, a wonderful presentation and lots of suggestions for research going forward. So we think of ourselves as specialists across the lifespan, and prevention is in our DNA or our mRNA. And because it is, I wonder when prevention starts. And there was a very interesting slide that you presented in which the group that was between age 65 and 74 had the greatest improvement with your intervention compared to the older population, which isn't always the case with respect to an impairment improvement. And I think that's really, really critical. So are the risk factors universal? So if my gait speed starts falling off at age 50 as opposed to 95 or whatever, do I use that as the step in for engaging in a more preventive or early interventive strategy? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And that's exactly what we're doing in VA, because one thing that has been recognized with veterans is that if you age match veterans, they're more functionally limited and more impaired than their civilian counterparts. And a lot of that may have to do with not only their exposure to maybe injuries in the military and so forth, but also it's recognized trauma from their military experience, and also other social and behavioral factors that preceded their military experience. But regardless, it's recognized. And so with some of the clinical trials that we're doing, we're actually starting looking at individuals that are 55 years and older. And so I qualify for my own studies by age. But also there's some really nice data from researchers at University of Indiana, where they've actually looked at less privileged parts of Indianapolis. And they looked at people in their 40s. And what they found was that the SPPB still held, just the cut points were a little bit different. But if you looked at them from a population standpoint and you developed cut points, you still saw the same risks. So I do think that these higher risk populations, these relationships still hold. You may have to adjust your cut points.
That is so critical for issues of health disparities.
Yeah.
And for other, shall we say, important social factors, which tend to be looked at in the participation rather than in the impairment or in the performance metrics. And we may have to shift our thinking a bit to accommodate for that. So I think this is a really important point. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Well, Jonathan, you said his name, John White, and then he raised his hand. So John, you want to come on?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Excellent. I agree that your presentation was excellent, along with everyone else. You sort of alluded to this, but it seems like gait speed, for example, is a good indicator to some degree because it catches variance from a lot of potential impairment sources, right? And, you know, the analogy to the orchestra, we know the orchestra sounds bad, but there's still going to be the question of intervention, you know, which section has to practice harder. And so I guess I'm just wondering, I mean, presumably we don't just practice people walking faster and that will solve everyone's problems. So one strategy involves sort of trying to unpack the impairments that lead to this particular person walking slowly or failing whatever screening it is. And now this one is going to get, you know, strength, or this one's going to get cardiorespiratory training or what have you. But then given also the relationship to more participation things, another possible way to go is the notion that greater activity involves walking faster and breathing more, and you know, so that the macro intervention may perhaps somewhat dumbly address a bunch of different underlying impairments at the same time. So do you have any guidance sort of about how to go from screening to thinking about what the specific interventions need to be more?
Yeah, you know, I can give you a couple examples that reinforce your question. So again, Linda Fried, who's just done amazing work over the course of her career, led this program in the city of Baltimore called Experience Cores. And what they focused on was, again, let's say, basically less affluent individuals living in the city of Baltimore and maybe economically disadvantaged in other ways. And what they did was they actually engaged them in a program of volunteering in schools. And so embedded in it was a physical activity program. And what they ended up finding was that indeed their mobility overall improved, even though it wasn't the primary focus of what they were doing, because they had to get up, get dressed, get moving, get the bus, go down the stairs, fill in the blanks. So you're absolutely right. However, within those programs, when you look at some certain aspects of physical functioning, they may not have as significant improvements across sort of the blend of physical functions that, so that's one issue. The other is another study. There's sort of a famous study that really focused on the prevention of cognitive decline that was done in Finland. It's called the FINGER study. And they did a multifaceted treatment where they looked at engagement in activity, nutrition, exercise, and so forth. And they were able to improve cognition or show a blunting of cognitive decline. But what they didn't show was improvements in physical functioning because they weren't really prioritizing it and targeting it. So I think there's some combination of that. And what we've tried to do with our program of care is use it as a sort of jumpstart for people that are at risk to get them to a certain level. And then it's really kind of up to them. They may do a very impairment specific exercise program that they like, or they may end up rather going to a sewing class they have to travel to and do that. And that's where the what matters most comes in. We'll try to tailor, that's the sort of case management component where we go long term with them to meet their needs and what matters most to them.
Well, we have time for one more question. And I see George has his hand up. Do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Thanks very much. I'm very conscious at my age, very conscious of this concept of frailty. So the question I have is, You speak about those who are already old or near to being old. What is the message you're going to give to the young to stop them from reaching that stage? Thinking through the life course, what messages are you going to give to the young to stop them from needing your treatment?
You know, I think that it's about practicing healthy behaviors. I don't really work with, when you say you, me personally, the care, we're very focused on geriatric care and so forth. So I'm not really working with that population, but for primary care providers, it would be about eating well, you know, drinking in moderation, you know, all the sort of healthy behaviors that we would want, maintaining physical activity as well, obviously. And so it would be those sorts of preventative approaches that are well recognized at helping people to maintain their function and independence and health.
So this is a general nostrum and nothing specific you would have suggested.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything specific with regard to that with respect to frailty.
Okay.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Jonathan. There's one more question in the chat, which I am hoping you'll be able to answer quickly in the chat as we move on to our next presenter. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Juergen Bauer, who comes to us today from the Center for Geriatric Medicine and the Network for Aging Research at Heidelberg University in Germany. And here's a bit of trivia for you. Heidelberg University is Germany's oldest university and was founded, you know, just yesterday in 1386. So we're really lucky to have Dr. Bauer. He is an internationally respected leader in geriatrics. In September of 2016, he assumed the newly established chair for geriatric medicine at his institution, and prior to that had served as the director for geriatric medicine. His record of service to national and international medical societies is really more than laudable. And I'll just share just a couple of examples. From 2007 to 2015, he served as a member of the executive board of the European Geriatric Medicine Society. He's currently a member of its academic board and served as president in 2018. He's also served as the president of the German Society for Geriatric Medicine and was awarded that society's honorary prize in 2007. And if he wasn't busy enough, since 2015, Dr. Bauer has been a member of the Committee for Scientific Advisors for the International Osteoporosis Foundation. As the title of his presentation alludes to, Dr. Bauer's research focuses on nutrition and exercise in older persons. In the past 3 years alone, he has published 74 peer-reviewed manuscripts on these topics. We are just incredibly honored to have him here today to share his wisdom. After his talk, we'll take questions either by raising your hand and engaging in dialogue by putting your questions in the chat during or after his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Bauer, for joining us for this session. The Zoom room.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm really feel honored to give my presentation to you tonight. Just let me know whether you can see the slides properly.
Yes.
And also the change of the slides. Is it
Yes.
changing for you? Yes, thank you very much. So yes, I think Jonathan has really prepared the ground for me where I can easily start from. And as you all know, aging is a universal phenomenon. You see here on the left side, 2015, the countries that had a percentage above 30 of 60 years and older, it's only Japan, and this will move up until 2050 in many more countries. And I would like to let you know that Germany is one of the fastest aging societies in the world. So we're really concerned about the demographic shift, the social implications, etc. Well, it's very difficult not to talk about COVID if you give a talk these days. And this is a very recent publication from the International Journal of Epidemiology. And we're talking about longevity and its implications. And what you can see here, let's focus on the age 60 group, that during the period between 2015 and 19, you see this on the right side, in nearly all Western countries, there has a prolonging of life. There was longer lifespan. And then considering the change in 2020 with different relevance and different amount of losing lifespan is obvious. So the pandemic really sets us back several years. It will take quite long to achieve the longevity prognosis again that we've lost during the last, let's say, 18 months. So there was a relevant decrease of lifespan in the older population above age 60, and there is, as you all know, this has been addressed before. There's a worsening physical conditioning in the older population between 50 and 80, like shown here, based on a representative online survey of 2006 US adults. And this is also causing worsening mobility. And this, as a consequence, causes more falls. So what we are concerned about is we already have an aging phenomenon which really will stress society with regard to long-term nursing care, for example. We already have a shortage of those kind of nurses in our country. The numbers will go up steeply, and the pandemic has done this even worse. So what we're not focusing now as geriatricians, it's not lifespan anymore. We are focusing on functional optimal span or best span or health span. That's what we are addressing, and Oljanski already in 2018 addressed this issue that society has to be concerned much more on health span than on lifespan. And with regard to functionality and independence, the older individual is vulnerable. Like you've seen before, frailty is, like Jonathan said, it's a concept of vulnerability. I think it's an equivalent of biological age, and originally has been multidimensional. The physical frailty is only part of the larger concept of frailty. Frailty is integrating a lot of influences. And I think it's a difficult concept with regard to functioning because it's nearly going beyond that. But this would be a separate discussion. I cannot go there, of course. So what we as geriatricians, we want to keep those older people as long as possible, physically active, independent. But this independency is threatened by the interaction between sarcopenia, I will address this later on, and frailty. But of course, all is connected somehow. That's one of the problems of aging. You never meet or hardly meet a condition on its own. It's all interconnected. And this makes things sometimes very complicated, and there's sometimes not an easy solution towards keeping people independent. And I also have to focus somehow with regard to scientific evidence, and I will leave out cognition, because cognition, like we've heard before, is also highly relevant for keeping older people functionally active. But I want to focus very much on mobility. So maybe giving us some kind of additional perspective on the training we've just heard before. So what is the background? Let's start very easy. It's body composition change there. And if you look at large statistics, you see you have a plateau of weight around about age 50 to 70. And then you have, on average, you have a slow decrease of about 450 grams in males and about 200 grams in females with regard to body weight. And you see this here. It's quite an old slide, but it's still relevant. No change there. And unfortunately, these 450, 200 grams in a rather healthy population is caused by a decline of fat-free mass, which is mostly muscle. And in parallel, the fat mass, like you see below here, yellow, it goes up. So we have a disproportionate effect between muscle mass and fat mass. And this is illustrated by this slide. On the left side, you have about 25-year-old, a cut, CT cut through the thigh muscle. And you see on the right side, you see the change with age 80. And you see much more fat subcutaneously and intracellular and in the septa. So much more fat, less muscle. This is a difference of about 40%. And that's a background. We're talking about if we want to talk about interventions, and we have to consider this is a lifelong perspective. It's really important how far you trained when you were young, how active you've been up there, how your maximum was, maximum muscle, maximum peak bone mass. You have to set your level high up, because then most probably it's a very individual progress. But if you raise your maximums, then you have more to rely on when this goes down with older age. The muscle mass goes down, but of course also strength goes down. It goes down in everybody, but you start from a different level. And if you're lucky enough, and this has been shown in the last slide, you don't reach the level of disability. And this is true for the upper extremities, which you see in the lower half of this graph, and it's true for the lower extremity for both genders, like you see in the upper part of this slide. So loss of muscle mass and loss of strength is the concept here we have to tackle if we want to keep people active, functioning, mobile in older age. And I think a concept which is also overlapping with frailty. And I personally think frailty is more a risk assessment, like said before. And if you really want to focus on function, I think the sarcopenia concept is maybe more suitable in many regards, because it's much closer related to muscle function. Gait is a complicated thing. There's a lot of neurological input with regard to gait speed. So if you stick with the muscles, sometimes things get a little bit easier. Sarcopenia means nowadays always a combination of the muscle mass, low muscle mass, lower than average muscle in an older population. It's the worst part of the older population, and a combination with a muscle strength of function parameter that is mostly directly connected to the muscle. And it's a complex etiology, of course, if you look at sarcopenia. But what I want to stress here, and then we really move right into the main topic of this talk, which is nutrition. It's not nutrition only, but nutrition, it's a much more important player in an older population than in a younger population. Of course, we talk a lot about obesity, about malnutrition in younger individuals, in patients with chronic disease. That's true. But we have vulnerability in the older individual, and this vulnerability is about reduced reserves, which is reflected in the change of body composition, like I've showed you before. And you have to keep your reserves as long as you can. And if you lose reserves, you have earlier functional impairment if you lose muscle mass. And that's a complete change. If you look at younger population, not the most serious ill, like people on hemodialysis, you see accelerated aging in this patient group, but that's not in general. But you find this vulnerability with older age. So you have to keep really a close eye on the nutritional factors if you want to keep your older individual functionally active. It's not only about malnutrition only, that's very closely related to a decline in muscle and function and strength, but it's also very important for prevention. If you want to be on the upper level of functioning, you have to check nutrition for a long period, and you have to follow preventive rules. But this slide shows you this interrelation between comorbidities, immobilization, medication, which is also highly relevant for appetite. Appetite gets more vulnerable in the older individual. So you have vulnerability with regard to reserves, but you also have less appetite. This is more often impaired by medication, by immobilization. So you really meet somehow a difficult condition, always at risk of losing appetite, always at risk of losing weight, which is a characteristic of the older individual, let's say beyond age 75 or 80. So you have to get a clear understanding. Nutrition is highly relevant in this patient population, also in the non-patient, pre-patient period of this population. And you have to be more preventive with regard to nutrition than in any other age group, because you want to keep your reserves. That's what I wanted to illustrate based on some slides that underline the concept of sarcopenia, keeping muscle mass, keeping strength, keeping function in this population. This is a very famous slide. It shows you the hallmarks of aging. And yes, we are moving closer to a pharmaceutical therapy of aging. You may be aware of the TAME study with metformin, which tackles some of those hallmarks of aging and which wants to stop degenerative age-associated diseases and functional decline. And we'll see whether this works. But there are other substances that are tested already now, some in animal experiments, but some already in human population. We'll see about that, which is still highly relevant to focus on those hallmark processes is, like shown on the left side of this slide, is exercise, which is the best thing to overcome anabolic resistance of aging, but also diet. And that's what we want to talk about now. Let's start with prevention. Fortunately, it's not about industrial products. It's about tasty food. It's attractive food. It's Mediterranean diet. And there's some molecular work, there's some clinical work that Mediterranean diet has a lot of qualities that tackles the aging processes like the oxidation, the chronic low-grade inflammation, which is relevant for muscle loss in an older population, maybe a favorable as a base load, which is also helpful. And by these mechanisms, it may reduce the muscle loss and may reduce the deterioration of muscle function. That's the concept. But does this work? There has been a study already published in 2011 by Luigi Ferrucci, among others. You will be very much aware of him. He's the director of the National Institute of Aging in Baltimore. They could show, and you're already aware of the SPBB, they had, if you followed strictly, if you adhered strictly to the Mediterranean diet, in an Italian population, in the Inchianti study is really a rather well-performing population in Tuscany, around Greve, which is the Chianti region. And they could show, for one, that you have a higher SPBB score if you have a higher adherence during follow-up, during the study, 9-year follow-up. But even more important, if you have a high adherence, your risk of mobility disability is significantly reduced by around 50% during a 9-year follow-up. This was the first indication that the relevance of following the Mediterranean diet for improved functionality over 9 years follow-up. And recently Carlson published data from Sweden, so you don't have to live in Italy to have a protective effect, a preventive effect from the Mediterranean diet. You also have, I recently talked to colleagues from Hong Kong, they also score for Mediterranean diet components there. So if you follow again, if you have a high adherence, they could show again with the concept of sarcopenia, combination of loss of muscle mass and mostly loss of strength, that you have all again in 16 years, a 50% reduction of incident sarcopenia in a Swedish population. So this goes towards the same observation. So can you do badly as well? Yes, you can. If you follow the British diet, you may be aware of, is not a healthy diet. It's really fatty. You see some components of the British diet on the right side, and I think you can easily understand that this is not a healthy diet. And if you on the left side, you see DB2 is the traditional British diet. And if you look at baseline at the 3-year prevalence, this is quite highly significant. You have about a 2.6 higher risk of being sarcopenic if you follow follow a fat-rich diet in an older population, extremely older population. It's the new concept beyond group. And can you do something if you have, again, a lifelong perspective, can you do something if you're middle age, if you're 45, 50? Because Lynn also asked me to speak about prevention on a more longer, not only the older population, but midlife. If you 40, 50, etc., yes, you can. And this is quite a recent publication coming from the US. Again, the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging. And they tested, did diet scores based on this tool, which is mentioned in the title, if you improve your diet based on these categories here, you can get a better result during a long-term follow-up with regard to functionality, again, based on the SPBB that has been introduced to you by Jonathan. So again, underlining the positive effect of a healthy diet, a long-term effect, mostly it's not a short-term effect. If you do prevention towards aging, in my perception, it's longer intervals, big studies, long follow-ups. It's never done quickly. You may be aware of the Do Health study, which has been recently published in JAMA. They tried to do a lot of preventive measures, and they didn't result in improved functionality. And I think you have to have longer intervals, and it's helpful to really go for higher age or for also for a population at risk. So summarizing this first part of my talk, I would say, yes, if you go to natural food components, there is a positive effect, which is related to food quality, which is also relevant not to include components of the nutrition that may impair metabolism, may cause inflammation, like saturated fatty acids, for example. So if you have high quality foods, rich in vitamins, in minerals, etc., you get a positive effect with regard to function, and which is also relevant, it's protein. So if you have protein-rich foods, these may also stabilize muscle loss in older age. And that's the second part I want to talk about. I want to talk about protein intake and the muscle in the older population. Like on this slide, you see some healthy and less healthy components, like you see beef, beyond. So you don't serve a T-bone steak now after this talk to your older patients in hospital. You don't do that. You have other sources. What's the problem with protein? You may be aware of that quite a percentage of older individuals don't have adequate access to good protein sources. That's one part of the story. But there's a phenomenon, many researchers in the world are now really supporting this concept. It's the concept of anabolic resistance. So there's a reduced ability to use the protein that you ingest to build the muscle, to support muscle protein synthesis. There are also, of course, inflammatory conditions that may cause a greater need for protein. And if you have less protein, you have a greater loss of functionality, which concerns the muscle and the bone. Muscle, as you're aware, you're rehabilitation specialist, the interaction between muscle and bone it's one system. So we have to think it very closely together. And we also see more data coming up that support with regard to bone quality, higher protein intake. Here you see the problems in an older population with regard to protein intake, insufficient protein intake. You see about 20% of all individuals don't reach the threshold of 0.8, which is currently still the WHO recommendation. And if you say, if you want to have an optimal protein intake in an older, possibly at risk population, you should move it up to at least 1.0. This percentage increases up to 40–45%. Well, is this based on science? Is there enough evidence? This is still discussed, especially in the US, but there are data from the US, like the first study from Houston, which has been highly relevant for the field. And this study showed that if you are in the lowest quintile of protein intake in a large population, this has been served during a 3-year follow-up, you have a higher decline of muscle mass. And if you are in the top quintile with regard to protein, you have 40% less of muscle loss in this same population. This is muscle and function. It's a difficult issue because regarding the methods we want to assess muscle mass is not the whole story, because there's not a close relationship between muscle mass, loss of muscle mass, and loss of function. Therefore, it's very important to support these data that loss of muscle mass is less with higher protein intake with functional data. And this has been done by the same group, published in 2017. And they could show that with higher protein intake, you have a less incident mobility limitations. So you are better off with regard to gait speed, with strength, if you have a higher protein intake, possibly always beyond 1 gram protein per kilogram body weight. This has also been shown in clinical populations that are also part of the rehab setting or rehab population, for example, in a population with knee osteoarthritis. And the majority of the subjects with knee osteoarthritis had a protein intake that was lower than the recommended daily allowance. And lower protein intake, again, was associated with lower upper leg strength. So the preventive effect of higher protein intake was underlined once more. Like I told you before, there's the concept of anabolic resistance with aging. This can possibly be overcome by higher protein intake, but it will certainly be overcome by exercise. And this is mostly strength training, where it could be shown most efficiently. Some molecular data supporting this concept: if you want to reach the maximum plateau of muscle protein synthesis, it's a different threshold if you compare younger men with older men. So if you are older, you move right on this scale. You have to invest more protein to reach this plateau. And this is underlining the concept of anabolic resistance for the older population. So our expert group started in about 2013 to ask for a higher protein intake for the older population as a preventive measure against muscle loss and loss of muscle strength in the older population. And we called this optimal protein intake because it's not on the same level like protein allowances. We know in the population that is getting older and older on average, we have a higher risk of functional decline with older age, and we want to counteract this development by increasing a protein intake. Like shown before, there are much more data out there, which are unfortunately mostly observational. There are not that many intervention studies that focus on milk protein, for example, unfortunately. But if you raise the protein intake, you can expect positive effects. If you have overt sarcopenia or frailty, if you are beyond the risk group, if you're affected by these geriatric syndromes, like we call them, then a higher protein intake up to 1.4 gram per kilogram body weight per day is recommended, but be aware, don't go far beyond that. If you increase protein intake beyond 1.4, you might have a negative effect on appetite. And if you have an early satiating effect by the protein, you may have a problem with the overall caloric intake. Because the caloric intake in the older population, it's always the first target you have to meet. You always have to meet the adequate caloric intake, and only the next step is the adequate or optimal protein intake. So never forget about this. So if you go up too steeply in an older individual with protein intake, you might have a negative effect on the caloric intake, and this might overcome the positive effect of the higher protein intake. That's very, very important to have a really, let's say, differentiated view on the macronutrients that are indicated for at-risk older populations. In most Western societies, you have the highest protein intake during the evening. So you have a very skewed balance of protein intake of the day. And many researchers at the moment think that this should be more balanced. And the perfect intervention would be if you pass over the plateau that I've shown you before for muscle protein synthesis during several meals during the day, which would be breakfast, which would be lunch, and which would be dinner. So one main target could be to increase protein intake at breakfast, because and this is shown here, it's usually the lowest protein intake of the day is during breakfast. So maybe this can be a target, and this has been shown already in several studies, that you can raise the overall protein intake over the day, the summation of the protein intake, if you target breakfast. Well, another thing, of course, in the context of prevention and possibly therapy is, of course, vitamin D. This has been something which was a hype, we have to say. We did expect a lot of effects from vitamin D. We did expect, but vitamin D, based on the current evidence, didn't meet the expected. And what we can say now, the effects of vitamin D supplementations are very, very minor. And obviously, with regard to strength, muscle strength, there is some effect, small effect, only if real vitamin deficiency is present. In this population, you might see an effect, but you don't see it if you're already beyond that. If you have a normal level of vitamin D, there is no linear correlation between strength effect and vitamin D levels. This has been a failure, and this has been the wrong expectation, and this was not met. This is very clearly now shown. This is a very, very good study done by Scheer, done in men and women beyond age 60. They had a rather low vitamin D levels. It was easily shown that you can raise the vitamin D by 800 international units per day, but there was no effect if you go from low to high in this study on any strength or functional parameters. So vitamin D is part of a healthy diet. And of course, we have a high risk of vitamin D deficiency, which clearly should be corrected, but there's no justified expectation that higher vitamin D supplementation is in anyhow justified by the effect on the muscle mass or function. But something that we've shown, sorry for this mix-up, that obviously it's helpful for increasing the effect of protein to counteract vitamin deficiency. So if you have a protein intake, a higher protein intake, this is helpful for muscle protein synthesis if you correct first vitamin D deficiency. So sorry for this. And this is, again, very important, just underlining this. I told you before, this is the Do Health study, which was coordinated by Heike Bischoff-Ferrari from Zurich. And she did several interventions in quite a large data set, very, I think, quite difficult study design, multinational study. And they did vitamin D supplementation, omega-3 fatty acid supplementation, strength training, exercise, but they could show no effects on function, SPBB again, no effect on cognition, no effects on fractures, no effect on infection, no effect on blood pressure. This was rather untargeted. So if you do intervention studies, most probably it's good to focus on real at-risk population. This population was quite heterogeneous, and unfortunately, this was very disappointing. Coming back once more and then finishing this part of the talk, vitamin D supplementation, how much? Don't go beyond 2000. We now recommend 800 units to 1000 units a day, and this would be safe. If you start to correct the deficiency, probably after hip fracture, you start maybe 2000 for 4 weeks or 8 weeks, then go back to 800 or 1000, but don't keep up the high doses for longer periods, and don't do pulsative vitamin D shots every 3 months or 6 months. There are several studies showing that you increase the false rate in these population. If you do 3 months or 6 months shots of high vitamin D doses, I think that's a very important message because obviously it might counteract the rehabilitation efforts. Well, can you do more? Can you have the best protein possibly and get a stronger effect on the muscle? Yes, obviously you may have if you target the right population. We are not talking about prevention now, we're talking about the sarcopenia population. And leucine is obviously a pivotal amino acid that acts as a catalysator, we say in Germany, catalysator, maybe it's the same word in English, I hope so. It strengthens the effect of the other proteins that are ingested in parallel with leucine. You don't give leucine on its own, you always combine it with other proteins. It always has to be a mix. So if we have a high leucine supplement, it's a whey protein, for example, then you get possibly the best effect. It's easily digestible. You get a strong effect, a very quick effect on muscle protein synthesis. And what we could show in a rather large study with about 400 participants, all with overt sarcopenia on the European sarcopenia criteria, we could show a positive effect on muscle and a positive effect on the chair rise test. So if you simply buy this supplement, which is something which is not a routine, of course, in a sarcopenia population, because always training is the key intervention, and it's strength training as a basic requirement in this population. But don't forget, you have sarcopenia patients that cannot train because they don't have an access. Some of our patients that have pelvic fractures and being sarcopenic, hip fractures and being sarcopenic, they start rehabilitation. We can discuss this later on, but it takes a while until they reach a plateau of the strength training, of the mobility, of the flexibility training, etc., that stabilizes the muscle loss. We are not allowed to underestimate the negative effect of the early post-operative phase in patients with hip fracture and in all those patients that are pain-associated, immobilized after pelvic fractures. And I think this can be an indication not only for high protein, but possibly for supplementation with leucine. Well, coming back what I said before, what we did in a post-hoc analysis of our study, we saw that those patients had a larger increase of muscle mass that started with a higher vitamin D level, that were not deficient. So therefore, we think it's good to correct the vitamin D deficiency if present, and combine it then with protein. You get a better effect on muscle protein synthesis, which results in a higher muscle mass. Well, is this our study only? Unfortunately not. We definitely did the largest study, but other researchers contributed to this field, and they could show that if you combine high quality protein with vitamin D, you get in this recently published meta-analysis, you get a positive effect on hand grip strength and also a positive effect on sit to stand time. But you don't get a significantly positive effect on walking speed. Again, walking speed is a complicated issue. That's why it's such a good indication of a risk, because there are more systems going into the parameter than only the muscle. It's even a stand-up performance is not only the muscle, of course, but obviously gait is even a more complicated functional process than a stand-up mechanism is. At least that's our concept. We can discuss this later on. And what we should again be aware of, that also geriatric syndrome like malnutrition, which is multi-etiological, it interferes directly with sarcopenia, vice versa, from two sides. It's not only malnutrition causing sarcopenia, but it's also if you have difficulty climbing stairs, you have a higher incidence of malnutrition because you have less appetite, you have maybe problems to access better nutrition, etc. So it goes in two ways. And this may, of course, cause a vicious cycle. Well, very briefly, it's not only the US, it's also Germany. I show you some really bad data on obesity and old age in Germany. You see here for women and men, you see we move up beyond 30% in the age group of 70 and 79. And that's very, very unfortunate. Because if we look at a long-term observational study coming from Finland, then of course, obesity in age 50, 60 is causing frailty, pre-frailty in later life. So obesity may be another challenge to society, in an aging society, if we are not training early in life, if we are not keeping physically active, then this really may cause serious problems. And this also is a trigger of disability in old age, like shown here. Higher BMI, having a higher percentage and a higher risk of lower activities of daily living. And the worst thing may be if we have obesity in combination with sarcopenia, but unfortunately, there have been no agreed definitions of this, again, geriatric syndrome, sarcopenic obesity, the combination of sarcopenia and obesity. Those two conditions shouldn't combine because they have really bad outcomes. They have also higher fracture rates. That's what has been shown. But at the moment, international experts groups still work on definitions and trying to agree on diagnostic criteria for this special condition. What can be said today is that obesity is impairing physical performance in the older population, causes more frailty during long-term follow-up studies, it decreases quality of life and increases dependency. So we have to keep our eye on malnutrition, clearly. We have to focus sarcopenia, and we have to be aware of obesity. And very often we have a mix of it all. And this makes things very often very difficult. As you are definitely aware of, the best remedy, the best drug against the aging process is physical activity. And it has been shown in a large number of experimental studies that this really tackles quite some hallmarks of aging. And what we can see is that you have to change possibly your way how you train when you get older. And that's I want to state this briefly. If we want to tackle sarcopenia, the muscle loss, if you have the muscle still as one outcome parameter, you have to do resistance exercise, because aerobic exercise and flexibility training, of course, does not increase the muscle like shown here. Skeletal muscle doesn't increase with these. So if you want to really go for the muscle, for the strength, you have to do resistance training. And this has to shift between age 50, 60, 70 towards the older population, 80. You have to change possibly the percentage that you want to invest in this population. And you have to increase the percentage that you invest into resistance training when compared to aerobic exercise. Coming to an end, like Jonathan said, it's a combination. You never go for one intervention alone. If you want to successful age, if you want to be good ager, then you have to combine the physical exercise, the training, you have to combine with nutrition and with your social interaction. And that's the last study I want to show. I love it. It's about art, life, and death. And this study, published in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, looked at a 14 years follow-up of art, consuming art. It's not making art, which I couldn't do, but I like to consume art. And if you're very much engaged with art and art, consuming art, going to galleries or to concerts, you have higher survival rate. And I think that's a good message for finishing this talk. I want to summarize. The relevance of adequate nutrition for functionality increases dramatically, in my view, with age, because it's a vulnerable population. Positive preventive effects of healthy diets like the Mediterranean diet on muscle mass and muscle function have been documented. Of course, we always need more study. Nutrition is never an easy focus of science. It's very complicated because of the interaction of other lifestyle factors with nutrition. An optimal intake of protein is effective in sarcopenia prevention, possibly also in therapy. Vitamin D deficiency has to be corrected, but oversupplementation has to be avoided because of possible side effects. And obesity in our populations with less physical activity is a serious threat, especially to those with less education. And this becomes very prominent in higher age. The concept of successful functional aging has to be multidimensional, cannot be nutrition alone, and it has to incorporate nutrition, physical exercise, and social interaction as equivalent components. Thank you very much for listening. These are 4 photographs from a German photographer. It's a book he published. He did photographs in all continents, and all those pictured here and all people in the book are far beyond age 100. And I think these pictures show how quality of life can be retained in an older population. I think it's a positive end of this talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. You're getting a round of applause, and I see Walter has his hand up to ask the very first question. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so take it away, Walter.
Be quick. Thank you very much. A fantastic talk and the importance of combining exercise and nutrition. Optimal exercise and good nutrition is clear, and I guess I completely believe in that, and you have provided strong support for that idea. One question that I have for you regarding the level of protein intake has to do with the recommended daily intake. You mentioned up to 1.2 or 1.4. My question to you has to do with this idea that people who are physically active may require more than the standard recommendation. So how would you recommend evaluating that additional need and actually, I guess, providing that additional protein if needed?
Well, I think those that are training well are not the at-risk group. So I think we see these data from the Netherlands, for example. We have a lot of countries that are beyond 1.0 regularly. So it's the regular intake, especially in milk drinking countries, is quite high. The problem is much greater, for example, in Asia, as the diet is much different regionally. So I think we wouldn't adapt the recommendation based on the activity level. I think I would target first 1.0 on a more general level, and the at-risk population during exercise, I would possibly supplement in the rehabilitation period, moving them up to 1.2. But I'm not a big fan of any extremes with regard to anything in the older population. I always would start moderate and only be very intense in a very small percentage of this population that is really suitable for this more sophisticated training, for this higher supplementation. So I would always play it safe.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Lynn, do you want to come in and
Yes.
ask your question?
Thank you. First of all, Juergen, thank you so much. I think we think of nutrition and macro and micronutrients as an afterthought. And just as we condemn our fellow health professionals of just refer to PT, we say refer to nutrition. But I think the time has come where there's lots of data that we need to know about. And on that, I actually have 2 questions. The first one is, can you elaborate a bit on the factors that may contribute to anabolic resistance? Clearly, aging and age is one of the biggest, as is activity, but are there physiological and other risk factors that we should be more attuned to and possibly target?
Well, this is the complicated thing. You have different levels. You have the general physiological aging process, and I think the chronic low-grade inflammation that is associated with aging may be a key player here. But it's only part of it, and we don't know exactly. We have some good cohort data on the relevance of chronic low-grade inflammation, but it's again only one part of it. And another thing is, of course, we have shifting hormonal levels and we have low testosterone, and low testosterone is some kind of a risk factor for even lower performance level and lower muscle mass. So it's definitely low-grade inflammation. It's definitely hormonal factors. And what we've missed out, we have definitely also changes in innervation. But the interest in looking at the neural part of it has been quite low. There was not a lot of research in patient population or sarcopenia population tackling the nerval side of it. So I think those are only 3 examples that we're looking into at the moment. But another thing, and we have first compounds trying to work on this, is mitochondrial dysfunction. And so I think that's the current new kids on the block. I cannot tell you which one is the one we can overcome and then create patient-relevant effects. But I think we're moving faster now from molecular analysis towards meaningful, possibly pharmacological or supplementation intervention. I think this is going much quicker in the years to come than we've seen the last 10 to 15 years.
So we are looking at secondary sarcopenia in our patients with fatty liver and NASH. And we have begun to sort out things like biological groupings of pro-inflammatory markers, growth factors. So insulin growth factor 1 and myokines, CCL1 and 3. And also looking now recently, to your point, at neuropeptides. So what is the role of the chromaffin cells and the serotonergic systems, tryptophan pathway, et cetera. So it's very complicated. I'm with you 100%, but I was thinking you could send me down the right pathway. Right?
Well, I would like to add, I think geriatric medicine, and I think it's a very similar picture in Europe and the US, it's not an easy discipline. It's something like a stigma, I have to say, very honest, because several reasons for that. But which is now really happening is the concept of frailty and also sarcopenia is going far beyond geriatric medicine. And American Society for the Study of Liver Disease has recently published a guideline and recommended screening for malnutrition, sarcopenia, and frailty in all patients with liver cirrhosis. And one example, and it goes towards pulmonology, heart disease. So the concept of muscle loss and functionality as a major determinant of the quality of life, that's the story that's entering the general field of medicine. I'm very pleased to learn about this. But I believe that we have to analyze someday the individual key players of the process. And we have to see it's a history or it's ongoing. And if it's ongoing, this would tackle then the phenomenon rightly, but we are not there. We're looking there, but this may be very complex, but I would love to have sarcopenia biomarkers that would identify the key player of the sarcopenia development on individual basis.
Does it matter if you consume plant or animal protein?
That's a huge story.
Sorry, you mean no yes or no to this?
No, that's difficult because in principle, I think data are out there that especially in younger population, it's equivalent in many respects if you consume plant or milk protein. But in the older population, there are some data that obviously some reserves of digestions are not optimal, and they benefit possibly more from the easy accessible animal protein more than from the plant protein, and the bulk associated with plants can impair appetite, possibly if you go towards higher plant-associated protein intake in a sarcopenia patient. There's already a vulnerable appetite situation. So that's why we recommend more milk protein, etc. But that's again a problem in India, Thailand, and other Asian countries that are not consuming milk.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we just have a couple more minutes, and I'd like to hand over the mic to Gerald, who'll take the last question with you before we wrap up.
Yes, so thank you very much for clarifying also the vitamin D issue. I think you made it very clear. In rheumatoid arthritis, we had kind of a similar starting point, creatine supplementation. I mean, you can increase muscle mass, you may even increase muscle strength, but it does not translate into people's functioning. So my question is, beyond inflammatory diseases, what do you think? Is it worthwhile to look for creatine phosphate in that population and at least to supplement to a normal level? Because what we found that some people that actually had a low level could get a better level, and maybe that could translate in better functioning.
Well, there's definitely something good in creatine supplementation as well, I think, in this population. Unfortunately, the literature is very scarce on creatine supplementation in the older population. So I think, to be honest, the big studies are driven by the industry. And obviously, the interest is different between the leucine supplementation concept and the creatine supplementation concept. So unfortunately, it cannot be said at the moment which kind of supplementation would be the best approach. In principle, we should not over-expect these effects, especially on a short-term basis. It's not the perfect tool. It's just an add-on tool in a highly at-risk population. That's what I see with the supplementation, and also limited for maybe 2 to 3 months. And it takes a lot of talking into the patient and it's the caregivers, because otherwise they just don't take the supplement. So we have to limit this subscription to the certain patients, definitely. And this goes for the creatine and the leucine, etc. as well, in my perception, at least. Thank you.
Well, Juergen, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to give Lynn the last word as we close out the session. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jonathan, if you're still on as well.
So thank you so much to our outstanding speakers. This will be recorded, and we are hoping, if everyone is willing, that we can come up with a summary document. It was absolutely groundbreaking and eye-opening for many of us, even those of us who've been around for a while. So thank you so much to our speakers and an exemplary audience, obviously engaged and connected and challenging. We very much appreciate that. We would like to thank you on behalf of the National Academy of Medicine for tuning in today. We hope that you would like to join for the award ceremony, which follows this at 4 o'clock. Your link should get you to that as well, for those of you who have registered. And we encourage you to participate in our future interest groups. Will be exciting and interesting going forward. Every year a different topic. And thank you again for your interest in rehabilitation and human function. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.